Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Chris O'Brien. I'm a SharePoint MVP. I focus more on the dev side of things, and unlike some of the other speakers and trainers, I don't really do much training. I'm generally busy on a SharePoint rollout of some sort 5 days a week. And this talk is really a result of some of the challenges that I've run into, especially on projects that involve a certain amount of development. In particular, the current project that I'm working on, it's quite challenging. It's for a UK retailer called Tesco. Tesco are a huge company. They've got 487,000 employees, big retailer. They're like double the size of Amazon in terms of revenue, profit. You might have seen my colleague Wes Hackett do a session on what we've built this morning. And we've got certain challenges on the project. We're quite a big dev team. So we've got 3 guys in the UK and around 7 in India. And it's quite challenging to coordinate everything and get everything to be a slick process. I said to the guy at Tesco that we delivered to, I said, I think some of these challenges that we hit on our project, I think we could solve them if we introduced automated builds, continuous integration. And he said, yes, I agree, 100%, but I don't want to pay for it. So I said, okay, well, I'm keen to see this happen, so how about I do some of the upfront work in my time out of hours, because I really want to see this happen, and then in return, you let me use the platform that we're building as a testbed at conferences, and maybe I'll talk about it on my blog. And Tesco said, hell yes. And I said, don't! So what I'm about to show, we don't have it running in Tesco yet, but I think it makes a better story when I show it you in the context of a real-life client project, rather than me doing it on a blank publishing site, a blank team site, or anything like that. So, things that we run into on dev projects. I've spoke about this quite a lot. It's a complex platform, okay? You know, it's much more complex than plain .NET. Many dependencies in things. We've got features, timer jobs, all those kind of things. And deployment is complex. That day that you take all your code base down to the client to deploy it, that can be a stressful day on SharePoint projects. And we have to think about certain things like, how do you roll back a WSP? Well, the answer is you can't. You know, the SharePoint platform doesn't natively support that. You can retract it, of course, but it's probably provisioned stuff in many content databases, and just taking away the WSP doesn't really undo that. That said, I do think it's important that we can always go back to previous versions of the code, previous versions of WSPs, and I think that we need to take whatever steps we can to facilitate a good rollback plan. I think SharePoint is difficult to unit test, okay? So we've got certain people that, you know, that's their thing, like Andrew Woodward, and I think that fundamentally it's difficult. We have to learn mocking frameworks, we have to learn lots of other things that aren't necessarily natural, and maybe, you know, it's useful if we look for alternatives. Now, going beyond the typical problem set, on larger SharePoint projects, I wonder if you ever see any of these. So, it's sometimes difficult to keep track. If you've got many developers, you've generally got quite a lot of code that's being churned out, and it's difficult to keep track of how to monitor the progress of certain fixes through the environments. You know, what's in dev, what's in UAT, what's in production. How do you manage that? You know, you start to need a little bit of discipline around your process. Inefficiency. So I took a 6-week coding break recently to focus on performance and scale. We're adding thousands of new users to our platform. When I came back to coding, it took me 4 whole days to get my virtual machine back up to scratch, back up with all the latest code. And that's because we don't have continuous integration yet. You know, I have to go out and find all the latest WSPs that the dev team have built, activate all the features, what documentation have we got, what Powershell have we got. That takes time. And maybe if we're leaking this time already, in individual devs having to spend this time getting their machines up to date, if we poured that into continuous integration instead, my bet is we'd be more efficient. I also see inconsistent builds. When we've got more than one person on the dev team that can build WSPs and put them in the deployment process, we get the human error factor coming in. So we've seen things like where the guy doing the build has pulled some projects down from source control, but he missed one. So we've got some versioning issues. Kind of things where something got built in debug mode accidentally. That's a pretty easy mistake to make if you're human. Another one that we've seen is where the devs have, they've been using something like, say, CKS Dev or WSP Builder, and what they've been doing is just copy into GAC, copy into SharePoint root, and they forgot to actually test the WSPs that are going forward for deployment. So, typical things. I think this isn't, particular to this project. I've seen it on many, many projects. So we want to try and solve these. Last but not least, communication. If you've got a big team, lots of code being produced, how does everybody know the status of where we are? How does everybody know whether we are good on some functionality but bad on others? What's the overall status of the build? Are we good? Are we broken? And we need something to help fix that. So if that's the problem, what can we do to fix it? So I think the first step is if we start to automate some of this and take out the human factor, we'll be in a better position. So if we auto-build our assemblies and WSPs, then we can be assured that it's always the correct version according to source control. There's no human mistake that can be made there. We can get the build system to add a label in source control. You can do labeling manually, nothing to stop you doing that. In my experience, it tends to be one of those things that gets forgotten about. But if you add a label at the time of creating a release, then you can always go back to those files and rebuild those WSPs if you need to. I still think, I said this last year here, I still think that we should be incrementing assembly numbers. And maybe the best way to do this isn't to increment the main assembly number if you're concerned about binding redirects and the complexity that that brings, but just use the assembly file version where you can put anything in there and it's just metadata, .NET doesn't care. What we could then do is perhaps assign the same label that we put against source control in that assembly build number. And we can easily see that's in source control, and that's in production, that's in UAT. We get to tie the two together. If we are automating this stuff, then let's go further and let's actually deploy it. We want to test these WSPs that have been built, and generally that's involving deploying to a SharePoint box that isn't a dev's machine. It's something that perhaps gets wiped every night or whatever we want to do. And then we talked about the complexity of unit testing. So where I am is I'm thinking more and more about UI testing as a good way to test custom code. It's pretty easy. I think it's a lot easier than unit testing. And when you see it, I think it's pretty cool. So I'd like to see what you think. And finally, notifications to the developers. If we're using a build system like Team Foundation Server, which is what I'm choosing for this talk, most of them come with some systray utility that's a bit like Toast. It pops up and it lets everybody on the dev team know the status of the build. So we kind of solve the communication problem a little bit with that. So if that was the recipe, let's think about the ingredients. So I'm choosing Team Foundation Server. I think it's a pretty good bet for SharePoint types. It comes free with every MSDN level, and that's one of the reasons I think it's kind of suited to Microsoft shops. So you get the server and one cal free. You have to buy additional cals for whoever interacts with it, but the server itself is free to MSDN holders. That comes with Team Build. That's the workflow element, and that kicks off the steps that happens every time we do an automated build. What we then probably need is some PowerShell. So PowerShell is what we might use to interact with SharePoint. We can deploy WSPs, create site collections, all those things that we probably want to do as part of the test. The remoting aspect of PowerShell is probably important. So unless you happen to have Team Foundation Server and SharePoint on one box, which I really don't recommend for production, if that's your production source control system, that is a bad idea. So we're more than likely going across boxes. We've separated things out. Then you need to think about the remoting. So you might have come across a tool that's been around for about 10 years called PSExec, written by sysinternals, that amazing couple of guys. Probably remoting is the modern version of this. It's probably preferred over PSExec, and you'd probably be able to use it more easily. Really what happens there is it's all about the invoke commandlet, and you just specify the computer name and what the script is to run. So it's not particularly scary. In terms of skills for this lot, I think you just need good enough PowerShell. You don't need to be Gary Lapointe. I'm certainly not. And it's the same with workflow. You don't need to be a workflow guru. You don't even need .NET 4 workflow experience, even though that's what we're working with in Team Foundation Server. If you've done Visual Studio Workflow somewhere along the line, you'll get to grips with it. It's actually simpler than a .NET 3.5 workflow. Okay, so what we're going to do is kind of break this problem up into three areas. We're going to talk about automating the build, then we'll talk about the UI testing, and then we'll talk about putting the UI tests into your automated build process. Okay, so first thing we need to think about is the style of automated builds or continuous integration that we do. The first one, I think, would be described as rebuild everything from the ground up. So whatever you've got, you'd probably delete it every night or every time the build runs. And that might be deleting web apps, or maybe you start at the site collection level, run some you do the deployment, run some PowerShell, create a new site collection, create some new webs, maybe activate features, boom. If you are post-live, maybe you don't care about that scenario so much. We've been live for about 12 months. In that time, we've rebuilt everything once, in some kind of DR scenario. What we do every 2 weeks, however, under Agile, we do Agile sprints, we deploy some new functionality to UAT at least, and that's the scenario that we care about a lot more. So there, we start to get concerned about state, and really we're concerned about, will this new stuff that we're building, when we deploy it against the current production server, is that going to work, or is that going to fail? In this second style, it does get more complex, and maybe you need to think about virtualization snapshots. And in your build process, you need to deploy to a snapshot that represents the current state of production. Now, Team Foundation Server kind of integrates with Hyper-V in a special way here, specifically Hyper-V System Center Virtual Machine Manager. And there's a special workflow that comes out of the box that enables you to sort of pick a snapshot. It's got a wizard, it's all quite integrated, and that's great if you're on Hyper-V. If you're not, like us, it's a bit more challenging. I don't think it's insurmountable, but probably what you need to do is call out of your workflow to a command line thing like vm.exe, or whatever it is for VMware, and that will kind of revert to a snapshot at the beginning of your workflow. So a few things to think about there. Next thing to think about is, what is the trigger? What starts a build? Is it a button press that somebody does? Is it scheduled, so we're doing it nightly? Is it something that happens on every check-in? So every time a dev checks something in, we do a build. That can work if your build process is quite lightweight. Probably doesn't work so well if it takes an hour to complete. We've got rolling builds, so that's kind of the same, but we'll only do a certain number per hour. So if we know that the build takes 15 minutes, then we could configure it to say never do more than 4 per hour. And we've got a couple of other options that I'll show in the UI. And then finally, thinking about the build definition, we're then on to customizing the workflow. So for SharePoint builds, we get these out-of-the-box workflows from Team Foundation, but you do need to customize them. They are not suitable for SharePoint builds. And that's especially the case if we're going to put the testing in there. So there's several workflows out of the box. There's a default one, and then there's the lab process template, which is the one that really integrates with Hyper-V and helps you to do snapshots. Okay, so let's think about what this looks like. Now, I actually just want to change direction for a couple of minutes because, as I said at the beginning, I'm going to show you this in the context of a real client solution. So I just need to talk you around that for 2 minutes, and then we'll look at how we automate it. Okay, so this is the Tesco Intranet. So it's, it kind of needs some UI love, right? We'd be the first to say that. Actually, that seems to be quite low on our client's priority list right now. But it's interesting in a few ways. So we don't have a classic intranet homepage. Everything is around the My Site. So if you saw Wes's session in the community track this morning, he went into detail about the decisions that we took and what's different about this, this solution. So you get sent to your own My Site, which means that you can put whatever you want on there, and that's your intranet homepage. And we go quite big on some of the social features of SharePoint 2010, in particular the activity feed. So we've got this kind of in the front and center. This is just on my laptop, and it's all a bit out of date. I don't really have a great set of things in the activity feed, but we've customized it in a few ways. So what we've got is we've got some better rendering, first of all. So if you look at what we've done, you know, we've got some images here. I picked some bad ones. They haven't got a transparent background, but we've put the actual images in. for something like this, an announcement, we don't just get the headline, we get some detail. For where we've got a colleague, we see a picture of the colleague, and it's a bit richer. When I compare it to what you'd get out of the box, that looks like that, and you can see that it's just not quite as much fun to interact with. Where we've got the images, we've just got some file names. Where we've got an announcement, we've just got the headline. Added a new colleague, we've just got a name. You know, it's okay, but it's not great. What we've also done is put a lot more into the activity feed. So perhaps more important than rendering, we've put much more than what you would get out of the box. So what you would get is typically the people that you have colleagued, people that are your colleagues, you would see their status updates, their profile updates, if they change manager, things that they've tagged, things like that. Don't you think it's crazy that you don't see any documents in there? SharePoint's a document-centric system for the most part, but you'll never see anything related to a document in there. So this is the kind of thing that we've built. So we've got documents, wiki pages, audio, video, announcements, images, lots of things like that that we think that people do want to see in their activity feed. And then finally, we talked to, well, the other thing that we've really done is gone beyond the colleague relationship. And this is the bit that I'm going to show in the UI testing. We had lots of conversations with the client about how things get in the activity feed. And we said it's all about the colleague relationship. It's like being a friend on Facebook. And they said, but what if I just don't want to be colleagues with these people? What if I don't want to see their status updates? I don't want to see, you know, all those other things. I can't dial that down just by individuals. So, you know, is that my only option? And we said, yes, that's how SharePoint works. So what we ended up doing to kind of go beyond this is we have the ability to subscribe. So if I see an amazing team site somewhere in the estate, and I think, hey, there's loads of SharePoint dev documents that are really relevant to me, I can subscribe to that, even though I don't really care about the people or I don't want to have a colleague relationship with them. So if I go into a team site, this is just an empty one based on one of our project management templates. I can, in the Site Actions menu, I can subscribe there, and then I'll start to see new content in my activity feed. And I can even do it on the kind of a more granular level. So if there's a particular document library, then I can come in here, you've got some ribbon buttons, and I can subscribe, and then I'll then see updates in my activity feed of content that ends up in here. So you start to see that this is kind of really good for UI testing. Okay, you know, we do lots of UI customizations, and it's kind of a really good candidate for automating the build and testing some of this UI stuff. So let's take a look at what that looks like if we're trying to apply it to a project like this. So this is our code base. We have quite a lot of projects. We're probably up to about 40 or 50. Expanding the code base all the time. We could do with rationalizing it a little bit, but that's where we are at the moment. If I tried to do an automated build of all of this stuff, it'd probably take about an hour, which we obviously can't do in an hour-long presentation. So what I have to do is pick a representative couple of projects, and we'll build those and deploy those. So my projects are under this demo folder, and let's go ahead and create a build for them. So I'm in Team Explorer over here on the right, and what I'm going to do is do a new build definition. I've got a couple of test ones there already, but we're going to create a new one here. Okay, let's close these. Okay, so we'll call this Core Activity Feed Projects. It's remembered it from last time I had a run through. I can put a description in here. We'll go to the trigger, and this is where I say whether it's manual, whether it's automatic on check-in, all that kind of stuff. A couple of other cool options like gated check-in. So that means if somebody goes to check in, the system will automatically do a build. If it succeeds, then the check-in will be allowed. If not, it'll be rejected. Sounds cool, but you need a rock-solid build system for that to work for you. And then we've got the other schedules. We'll leave this on manual for now. We'll do a workspace. I'm just going to narrow it down to my demo folder. Build defaults is where I say where the drop location is. So anything that gets built, where does it get copied to? And what I need to do here is specify my SharePoint box. So I need it copied from TFS to SharePoint. And I have a share on there called builds. and that's where things get copied to. Most of the action happens on this Process tab, and what I do here, I select the items to build. It's actually remembered the solution, but otherwise what I would do is use this dialog to basically browse across what code I have in TFS and pick solutions or projects. So the best kind of way of doing this is actually to group projects together in solutions which have project references for the dependencies. So perhaps move away from file references and use project references as a way to deal with those. So it's already got the one I want. I'm happy with that. And I can now pick the configuration. So what I'm going to do is select Release and any CPU. So here I'm starting to get assured that we're not accidentally going to do a debug build. I have a section for automated tests in here. I'm not going to do anything with that yet, but notice that it's automatically going to test anything where the assembly name has test in the DLL name. So there's some other settings that I want to set just to make the build quicker. So I'm going to turn a couple of these off, like does it create a work item if a test fails. It's kind of a neat feature that it will go into somebody's task list if we do have a failing build. And one really important thing is this magic flag that I'm adding here. And this is P is packaging equals true. And what this does is make Team Foundation Server call into the SharePoint tools so that it builds WSPs. Otherwise, we only get DLLs, which aren't too handy for us in the SharePoint world. And what we then do is think about the workflow aspect of this. So this is in this section up here, the build process template, and I have a drop down to select from some workflow definitions, XAML files, that I want to use for my workflow. The best practice is to always take a copy of one. What we're going to do is copy the default template, which is this one here, and we'll call this Tesco Big Build. And what that's going to do is take a copy of that out of the box workflow and give me a new copy that I can modify. So there's the link. And what you see it's done is it's put it in TFS, but I don't have a local copy yet. So we'll do a get latest, and then we'll edit it. So this is the bit where we have to think about modifying a .NET 4 workflow. It's not too complex, but one big difference is that we don't have any kind of ad hoc code behind the workflow. So in a Visual Studio workflow before that you might have done in SharePoint, you can just put code behind any activity. Now there is no code behind this. It's all wrapped up in the workflow activities. So if I want to do something really custom, I probably need to code a new activity. Then it will appear in the toolbox on the left, and I can drop it in. So what we see is that this is quite a detailed workflow. It's probably implemented in quite a purist way, I would say. And you can kind of delve down, and you can be like 10 levels deep. You get a bit lost, but what you can always do is click Collapse All, which takes you to the very top of the workflow, and that's kind of the fundamentals. I know that most of the action happens in this run on build agent, so this is a section that runs on my build server. What I'm going to do is pull my toolbox open, and here are the activities that I can drop into my workspace, into my workflow. And it's lots of TFS-related things like convert workspace item gets me the path on the file system compared to the path in source control. Another really important one is invoke process. That lets me call out to something outside of the workflow, like PowerShell, and we're going to use that. So for now, what I'm going to do, and here's the other activities, by the way, that are valid if you have Hyper-V and Virtual Machine Manager. So that helps me work with snapshots. We don't have that. That's kind of out of scope for my talk, so we won't look at that. So what we're going to do is quickly drag on a sequence. Sequence is a group of activities in a workflow. And what we'll do is we'll give that a name. So we'll say deploy WSPs and run tests. Put some asterisks in there so we can recognize it. And then for now, all I'm going to do is drop a build message in there. And we'll configure this shape now. We're going to change the importance so that it definitely appears and we definitely see it. So This is kind of like a little code helper window where I get IntelliSense. We'll change that to high, and then we'll write the message. So we'll say, would be deploying WSPs here. Now the red blob should disappear. That should be valid. What I'm going to do is save that. And now I'm going to save my actual workflow definition. One thing I want to do now is I have the TFS build notification tool open. And this is what we suggest that every dev runs on their machine. And what I'm going to do is make sure that our new build, I want to be notified about it. So what I'm saying is that give me a notification when a build gets queued, started, or finished. Okay, so I think we're ready to check in. We've customized our workflow. Let's check that in, and now let's run it. Actually, I just want to check that none of these old workflows were set to auto start. Nope. No, it's fine. Okay, so core activity feed projects is the one that we're running with. Let's queue a new build. So we're pressing the button to run this. I've got a dialog that lets me override some of the parameters. I'm okay with what I put in as the defaults. And now we should have a build that's running. So this is our window onto what's running and what's completed. I can double click this and get some detail on what's running. And what we should start to see is that Visual Studio and TFS is starting to run through our workflow. This is actually a view onto a log file, which is just a text file on the file system, but it gives us some nice rendering, and it updates kind of every 10 or 15 seconds, so any minute now we should start to see some content. Okay, so the build's kicked off. Notice, however, we haven't had the notification toast yet. You know, I don't know if you've been looking out for that, but that thing is always way late, okay? It just never kind of is quite on time. But I guess you don't really care. If you're busy getting on with your day job and you're coding or in office or whatever else, then as long as you get some indication at some point, then I don't think you need it right on the second. So this is building, building, building. And we're doing lots of actions like deleting directories, tidying up, and then we're about to do a get latest from source control. And what should happen is that we, okay, so it's created the label in there. It's going to do a get latest of those projects that I specified. It's going to build the assemblies, and then if our packaging is okay, it's going to build the WSPs, and it's going to put that lot somewhere in a drop location. Okay, so looks like that succeeded. We've got a green tick there. Now, notice that I've got a couple of interesting things here. I see some compiler warnings that, you know, of the kind that you would see if you were doing the dev yourself. That's kind of interesting because that's not code I've written. So I get an insight into what my colleagues are producing and any warnings that the C# compiler would give. I can see a fuller log by going to the view log. And that's just all the detail. I get to see everything that got run and all those things. You see at the bottom here that we did get to our would be deploying WSPs here, so that's where our customizations will really go. And if I go to the drop folder, I have a stack of DLLs, so that's some of the references and also the DLLs that we've built here. I can't turn that off, unfortunately, so I always get those. But here at the bottom, I've got some lovely WSPs that are really what I do care about. And that's kind of interesting because, remember, those WSPs are guaranteed to be built in release mode, guaranteed to have been a get latest and everything that I've said in source control. So we're starting to make progress. You know, this is the direction that we want to head in. So that's the basics of creating a build. In terms of actually deploying the WSPs, what I'm going to do is just kick off a workflow that I've already done. So the steps are too fiddly for me to do here live, but we'll kick it off and then we'll take a look. So there's the toast, by the way. If I can drag this up, you might be able to see it.
Did you add the build number into the message file?
No, not yet. So that's something, again, that I have to say is out of scope for the demo, but I have a link on how you do it. So there's one of the program managers for TFS has basically a sample that you can plug into your workflow, and that's sort of my recommendation on how you do it. Okay, so we've kicked off our completed build, right? And we'll just keep an eye on that for a second, make sure that starts. Okay, so that looks like it's happy and that's going to churn away. What I want to do now is we'll take a quick look in that workflow. So this is the workflow definition for this one. And what I want to show you here is that we've shuffled some shapes around, and really the main part of it is using this invoke process that can call out to PowerShell. I'll quickly show you that, and then we'll go take a look at the PowerShell so we understand some of the moving pieces. Okay, so lots of things in our workflow, but here's sort of the customization that I made, where this is really just an invoke process, and the file name is PowerShell, that you might be able to see down here in the properties, and the arguments, what I'm passing it is basically a PowerShell script, and this is on my TFS box, and that's my master build script. So that's the bulk of the customizations. We also had to shuffle some things around so that if we integrate testing, that happens after the WSP deployment. So the out-of-the-box workflows aren't quite suitable. We have to shuffle things around, but that's not too difficult. So if we just go check on the TFS box so I can show you the script, this is pretty simple on this box. What we are, I can't make that bigger, I'm afraid, but really there isn't a great deal going on here. We are collecting something from the workflow, and that's the drop location, because it changes every time. It's a subfolder, so that's important to us. And then it's really this PowerShell remoting thing where we use invoke command, we specify the computer name, which in our case is the SharePoint box, and then pass it basically the script to run. So what you can probably gather is that the bulk of the work really happens on the SharePoint box. If I look at the PowerShell there, this time in Power GUI, so it's all color-coded, we collect that drop location from the calling script, declare some stuff here, we do some cleanup there, recycle app pools, and really all we're doing here is getting all the WSP files in that directory, and then what I'm doing in this case is an update SP solution on them. So my continuous integration here is just about upgrading WSPs. And here's where we kind of diverge depending on what your project needs to do. Do you need to activate some features? Do you need to do something else? And maybe, you know, if you're post-go live, this changes on every sprint. You need to do a different thing every time, but fundamentally, you can start to see the mechanisms of the workflow calling into PowerShell. Now, if I just go back to check on that build to see how it was, what we see is that that completed, it was successful. What we'll do is we'll start to refresh that there. And what we should see in the log for this build is that in that section there, we're now doing lots of work. So we are upgrading WSPs. It found a couple of files and then waiting to finish the solution deployment job, and it's upgraded those WSPs. So if I come into here in Central Admin, what I should see in one of these, so that's last operation time 2:05, which is a couple of minutes ago. So we have indeed sent those WSPs across to SharePoint and upgraded them. So that's really automating the build. You know, there's a bit of complexity in there. The workflow customizations that I've done in the PowerShell, I'll post those somewhere on my blog or Codeplex, so that if anybody else wants to go down this track, you know, you've got a head start. but that's the fundamentals. It's not too complex, and I think it's pretty powerful. We don't have any sellotape technology. You know, like I see lots of people doing this stuff where it relies on a file being copied and the task scheduler kicking in, so it's really only able to work in an overnight process. What I want is something that I can hit the button on any time and I can trigger a build. If you do it the workflow way, then you've got that. So that's the build stuff. Now let's turn our attention to the UI testing and look at how we could start to bring that in. So what I want to do is just go there, make sure that's okay. We're going to start to add a new project to our code base now, and this is going to be a test project. So we'll just get that project created. This is a .NET 4 project type, because that's how Visual Studio 2010 testing works. We'll call this tesco.hub.tests. And what this gives me is a project with the right references. It gives me a unit test, but I don't like unit tests. Not here anyway. Don't say that on Twitter maybe, but we're going to delete that. And instead, what we're going to do is add a UI test. Now, this is called a coded UI test because it has code behind it. I don't write this code, but Visual Studio does. And it does it based on things that I've recorded. So it asks how I want to create it. I say yes, using the recorder. And what I get now is a little widget down here that I'll drag up there. As soon as I hit this record button, it's looking at what I'm doing with the mouse and keyboard. So I'm going to open up a new Internet Explorer window. I'm going to go to that blank team site that I have. And so this is my empty team site. I'm going to go into the documents area, and I'm going to test our customization that's based on the ribbon buttons and based on, you know, this subscription framework that we've built. So I'm going to click subscribe. That seemed to work. What I'm going to do there is generate the code for that. So what I'm going to say is that method is called subscribe to list. Now I haven't actually tested anything yet. I've just done the steps to get to a certain point. Visual Studio is churning away. It's building that code. Now what I'm going to do is in my widget I get a crosshair. I can drag this to something on the page, and it's finding things in the DOM underneath that I can select. In this case, what I want to do is test the status bar. So I've selected that, and now I get a property pane. What I want to do is test the inner text of this control. Right-click, add assertion. I'm going to say contains, and then I don't need the whole message because we might change that text at some point, but just that initial bit is what I'm going to use. And we'll generate the code for that. So we'll give that a method name of check. Okay, and what I'm actually going to do, just so that we deal with state, is I'll carry on recording, and here I'll actually do the reverse and unsubscribe, and I'll test now that we've got a message that says unsubscribed, basically. Okay, I'll add my assertion now. Oops. There we go. And this time I'm just testing for success status unsubscribed. And we'll do a contains again. We'll call that check unsubscription message. Okay, so that's my UI test recorded. I'm going to close my widget now, and Visual Studio is then going to finish generating that code. Okay, so here's what that code looks like. You see that the method names that I've got there, if I go into one of these, what you see is that we've got lots of code around browser windows and mouse and clicking and playback. I don't really need to worry about this. You know, I don't need to edit it. Visual Studio just takes care of it. So what we're going to do is make sure that builds, because it is code. And then let's see if we can play that test back. So go to test, go to the test list editor, run check tests, and let's see what happens. So what we're hoping is that Visual Studio opens a browser window, there we go. It's going to go to that team site, and it's literally going to drive the keyboard and mouse in the way that I did. So this is very much an interactive process. It really does take the desktop session from me, okay? And you need to think about that, and that's why it's good to have this stuff in an automated process that's not happening on any dev machine. So what we've got there is that that test passed. So, you know, we've developed a test, and it did seem to work well against the UI. So that's pretty cool. Now let's go a step further. So go on.
Will Visual Studio remember all the IE settings? Like if you close it with a non-maximized window, the button will be in a different place.
Yeah, so does Visual Studio remember some of your kind of setup on the desktop? Yes, it does. It has some smarts in there so that if you don't have an IE shortcut in the same place, it knows that what you really meant to do is open IE, so it will do it a different way. So yeah, it can deal with a lot of those things, yeah. Okay, so what we're going to do is check in our tests. And now, let's integrate those into the build. You might have remembered that earlier, the build will work if our test assembly has something, it's just got test in the name. And then the build workflow will automatically take care of it. So we don't really need to revisit the build workflow and put this in. It's automatically looking for an assembly that's got test in the name. And that's what we've got here. So to see it integrated, let's start to simulate a real dev process. Okay, so for fun, what we'll do is we'll go back to our build definition, and we'll change it from manual to continuous integration. So as soon as I make a dev change, somebody checks something in, we're going to trigger our build. And then let's go to our code base. Let's see what happens if a dev makes a mistake. If a dev introduces some code that's going to cause us a problem, let's see what happens when the build process kicks off and our UI tests run. So what I'm going to do here is I'm in our data access layer for our subscriptions framework, okay? And I'm not going to do anything too clever. I'm just going to simulate a bug. And what I'm going to do is throw a new exception. And I'm going to give it a message, dev did something silly. And I'm a good dev, I do like to test things, so let's at least check that builds, right? Okay, that's building. Okay, so that looks fine. So as a dev, I'm happy with that, so I'm going to check that in. And what we should see now is that a build is going to automatically kick off. Go to my build window. Yes, the build has indeed started. Okay, so we're that far down the build. Now, this is going to take a little while because we're going to deploy the WSPs. So let's let that churn away, and we'll sort of take a breath and just go back to the slides and think about some of the stuff that we've just done. Okay, so in terms of coded UI tests, they are something that you literally record on the desktop. Now, they support the browser, obviously. They support Ajax fully, so we've got Ajax behind our ribbon buttons there, so we kind of need that support. Silverlight, WPF, Windows Forms apps, they're all okay. If you have a fancy new HTML5 app, you can't UI test anything like that yet. So it is down to a set of fixed technologies that the recorder and playback mechanism can support. Really what happens there is we generate some code. And that's kind of interesting. So if you start to think about how this testing works, maybe you're starting to think, yeah, well, I get that, that's okay. but really I know that your UI could return a success message when really something failed at the back end. And you're right. But consider that because it's code, I could add in some of my own code there. Maybe I want to go off and check the database, check that a record did get updated. So although it's not a unit test in any sense of the word, it completely is an integration test. I do have the opportunity of customizing it and maybe putting in some integrity checks that I want. And you saw the process of adding an assertion. I'd love to kind of record more tests and see, what that looks like. But fundamentally, I think that you get the idea. We go to the browser, we record the steps, and we add assertions. So I could go to the web part gallery, I could check that big div, and I could check that a certain web part is present, and that gives me confidence that that feature got activated, the web part definition was okay. I could add it to a page, check that the output is okay. I could go to the feature settings page, check that a feature got activated by looking for the div next to the button. You can see that SharePoint has lots of these things that we could test quite easily with this stuff. And in terms of integrating this stuff into the build, it's automatic if you have test in your assembly name, but you do have to modify the sequence in the workflow. So by default, all this stuff that ships with TFS, it will try and run tests quite early in the process, straight after the assemblies have been built, probably because Microsoft are really thinking about unit tests. If we're thinking about UI tests, which have to wait for a certain series of steps, like WSPs to be deployed, we have to go in and modify those workflows. So I'll post my version and all the PowerShell that I've used in case anybody else wants to go down this route. And just so that you understand what's happening, the reason why it's all in there is because Microsoft allow all their test stuff to be run from the command line. It's mstest.exe, and Team Build has an activity in the workflow that you can drag on that has a call out to mstest. It's just that it's in there by default. So it's in their workflows that they already ship. Okay, so let's go back to the workflow, see how that works. Okay, so it looks like we've finished. Notice that I've got a compiler warning here. That links to my code, so I can actually go and see the problem in the code. I've got nice integration there. And if I see the log, I go and look and I see, yeah, all that stuff, what got logged. I see that we've got a UI test that failed. If I go back to the summary view, I have a link to the test results, actually. And what I get is kind of more detail on what happened. You can probably see from this section here that one of our asserts failed, and it's telling me the string that was there. And what it's telling me is that the string basically said, and there's the notification, by the way, that popped up on everybody's desk. I get the message that was shown. But, we didn't really see that. And if that was at 3 a.m., then, you kind of need to know what the UI looked like to help you diagnose this stuff. So we've got a big log at the bottom, and then we see that Visual Studio has actually taken a screenshot at the time, and what we see there is that instead of a green bar of loveliness, we've got a red bar of doom. And that helps us understand what the UI looked like, so we could then go and diagnose the problem. So you start to see that this is pretty powerful stuff. The other thing that it's done, based on the way I configured it, is we've got an XML file down here. And this shows me some details from the event log as XML. If I scroll down, I see what was happening at that time. And what I should see is an exception in the Windows event log, and there's my exception. So it says dev did something silly, and I start to understand what the UI looked like, what the event log looked like, and I can go on and trace my problem. So I think that's pretty powerful. I think that would help solve a lot of the dev problems on common dev projects. But we've got a problem. There's a gentleman down here in the front row, and he's not happy. He says, I want more. So let's try and make him happy. So I did a run-through of kind of a different set of settings, and if I just connect to that, we'll show you what else you can do here. So it's not really just about taking screenshots. So this is a similar run, just had more stuff being collected. And if I go to the test results for this run, it takes a little while to open up. And then these tests failed on this run, but that's not really what I care about too much. We'll open up the results, and then you start to see in that place there, if I had certain codecs on this machine and the desktop experience feature enabled, I can actually do a video recording. So that's going to help me understand even more about what was happening when the build failed. That's pretty cool. And then down at the bottom, we've got the usual log stuff. Down at the bottom, so I have my screenshot there in the PNG, I have the event log stuff there, but also what I've done is I've enabled a couple of other things. This VSP file is really the results of a code profiling session. So I don't know if you've ever used like JetBrains Profiler or anything like that. This is now baked into Visual Studio. And I can start to see the kind of bits of our code base that are taking the most time to execute. So if I go into one of these, I kind of start to get a graphical representation of where we are spending certain amounts of time in our code base. And I can kind of drill down these and see which is the offending method. Or if I go to the call tree, I can click on a process that was executing. I can click this flame button up here, and that expands to be the hot path in my code. So this is where we're spending quite a lot of time. Maybe this is where we need to optimize our code base. I can see that we've got a method called, in our subscriptions framework, and it's actually the create child controls method of our site actions menu item. And also the weather web part. You know, so I'm starting to get an insight onto some bits of our code base that maybe we should take a look at. And as your code base grows, devs checking code every night, if you've got this as a report, that's pretty handy for you to keep on top of potential problems in your code base. So that's pretty cool. The other thing that I really like is that, as well as the code profiling, I haven't got this fully working yet, but this is IntelliTrace, which is a new feature of Visual Studio 2010. And if any exceptions happen in my test run, what I can do is I'll see them in this list, and I don't have one of the exception that we actually saw there, but I can click this Start Debugging button, and that will take me directly into a debugging session with all the variables that were happening in that run. So it's recorded everything that was happening, and even if it was happening at 3 a.m., I can jump into a debugging session the next morning, see the values of variables, step through, and work out what the problem was. So I think that's pretty amazing. You know, so it's all baked into the tools. And I think it's pretty cool. Okay, so I think that's it for demos. So just to wrap up, we'll think about some things around that. So I guess the main message is, I've kind of focused on UI testing, but I think that we shouldn't stop there. The possibilities are quite wider. So we can do code analysis as well, so FXCOP style stuff. You know, what rules am I breaking in my code? Unit tests, of course. SP dispose check would be a good candidate to do here. IntelliTrace that we kind of saw, to even think about doing load tests if that was something that you wanted to do, and do the recording and also collect the data. Okay, so there's quite a lot in there, just to think about some best practices. I think you should start this on day 0 of your project. Okay? What I've found trying to apply it to Tesco is that retrofitting it is very expensive. If you've done 12 months worth of dev work and you're trying to automate all that, chances are that you don't have the PowerShell, lots of it was done manually, some documentation's in a Word doc, some's in a wiki, and it's quite expensive to get that up and running. So try and start at the beginning. I think you should get fast feedback. So maybe you have different types of build, and I think that what you should do is have something on every check-in that at the very least is compiling the assemblies across all of your code base, not just what got checked in, and also building the WSPs. And I think that would be a great step forward, because we know that certain things get validated on WSP build. Obviously, we have to think that all the dependencies in the code would be okay. And I think that every project, every SharePoint project should do that. So next week, when I go into the office, I'm definitely going to put that in place, because it doesn't take much. You know, you saw me do it in 3 minutes, and I think it's a huge benefit. Maybe you have a longer run overnight, but you've got more time to do things overnight. But every check-in, at least let's do that much. I think that we should implement assembly versioning. I still think that's important. And I've got a link on the next slide that's a good way to do it. It's kind of out of scope in the stuff I could cover today, but I certainly think that's important. And then finally, I think that we should all look at the UI testing. I think it's a great, easy to build framework. You know, we can easily do good testing on that. You don't have to include it as part of an automated build. You could just run with that if you thought that the build stuff was a bit complex or not what you wanted to do. So I think it's worth looking at. There's some resources, I'll leave those up, but that's things like how to do the assembly versioning, how to do some other things. I'm going to start blogging about this. I think it does seem that there is some interest, so I'll start a series on my blog. But that's it. Thank you very much.